in the factories.
Look for the Union label.
So we're going to look at three important early unions, okay, or 3.5, because one of them is the National Labor Union, and it lasts a few years is all. And some people call it the first National Labor Union, and of course it has that imaginative name. William Silvis was the man who was in charge of it there. We see a picture of old William. And of course, this is something you need to make sure you write down. They took skilled and unskilled workers, and they took in these farmers into their union, and that made them a little bit different. Now, a lot of people didn't like taking in unskilled workers, as you'll see. The problem with the unskilled workers is that they can be replaced very easily. Their jobs, which are often menial type jobs, sweeping and digging and doing basic work like that, can be learned in a matter of minutes or hours. And so these people could be easily replaced, whereas skilled workers, it might take months or years to retrain workers like that, and they had a lot more power when they went on strike. Now, they did try to include various groups here, as you can see. They included women, okay, which was rare, and here we see some old factory girls. They included African Americans, but a lot of the African Americans went and formed their own, as it was called, Negro National Labor Union. But one group, and you'll see this is very common throughout, that they wouldn't take, was the Chinese. The Chinese just would not be accepted, and there was a lot of prejudice against the Chinese throughout this period in American history. In fact, as you probably know, in 1882 they become the first group that we actually banned from the United States. Now, what are the goals of the National Labor Union? Well, first of all, they want to bring in all the different trade unions, that is, people that were, say, a carpenter or a person who was a mechanic, into one big union, and then create unions where there weren't unions across the nation, and of course get that day shortened down. And this is going to be something that many of the others wanted, an 8-hour day. But they're going to go a step further, and they're going to want a political party, and this is probably what's going to hurt them. Now, they do get one success. They get the federal government to create an 8-hour day, and even some states followed along and did that. But then what a lot of these governments did was reduce the wages. So you were working less each day, and you were making less each day, and they would then use that money to hire more workers to get the work done. So now, the National Labor Union, too, is usually considered a failure. It dies out, and one of the reasons is it tried to push for this political side too much. It wanted to get monetary reform, more greenbacks into there. Every time it ran candidates, it seemed to lose. And the Panic of 1873 that we'll talk about is going to end up killing it off completely, and many of its workers are going to go to the first truly successful union, and that. Now, the Knights of Labor are not the Knights who say knee. This is the Knights who say knee.
Who are you?
We are the Knights who say... Knee.
No, not the Knights who say knee.
The same.
Who are they?
We are the keepers of the sacred words. Knee. Peng.
Okay. Now, the Knights of Labor were founded by Terence Powderly. As you can see a picture of him here, he looks a lot like good old Coach Gillette, one of Dobie's most famous track coaches. And you can see their symbol here, and it says basically that is the most perfect government in which an injury to one is the concern of all. And you see that as a message here, which interestingly enough is going to be the motto of the IWW, the last union that we'll talk about. Now, they are considered a semi-successful union. They live for some time, even eventually reaching over 700,000 members. Now, much like the Masons, they kept themselves secret at first, secret handshakes and passwords and even initiation rites, which made it kind of fun to be a member, to be in on all this, but wasn't really good to attract a lot of people. But of course, this avoided management coming after them or firing workers because of their membership in unions, which could happen. Now, the National Labor Union and the Knights of Labor have this in common. They preferred what's known as arbitration. Now, there's mediation where people will sit you down and you'll try to work out some agreement, but arbitration is usually where you have both sides agree to one person listening to their concerns, and then that person will make a deal for both sides. And if it's called binding arbitration, this happens a lot with our athletes. It is you have to accept the results. You can't change your mind if you didn't get a very good deal. And I don't know if you guys use eBay or any of those kind of things, but if you ever really have a problem and it goes to the next level, they will use arbitration, and oftentimes the arbitrators are the people that they have picked. And some people, think they should be able to sue or whatever, but you got to read your rights when you join those things. Now, as I said, by 1886 they had over 730,000 people, and 1886 is going to mark their high point. Something's going to happen that year that's going to cause their numbers to drop. Now, they welcomed everybody, skilled workers, unskilled workers, women, blacks. Well, almost everybody. Guess who they left out? Yes, sadly, the Chinese. So, but here you see Mr. Evil welcoming everybody but the Chinese. Now, what were their goals of the knights or the Knights?
Show us the Grail. We shall take your castle by force.
You don't frighten us, English pig dogs. Go and boil your bottom, sons of a silly person. Blow my nose at you, so-called Arthur King. You and all your silly English Knights.
Now,
What a
of course,
strange
their
thirst.
big goal is the 8-hour workday, which was the goal of everybody, and we have that today, and they did win that for many government workers. They also had this idea to set up workers' co-ops, where workers might actually like buy stuff, purchase things together, work together to reduce the cost. Kind of like if you guys go to Sam's Wholesale, you can buy enough toilet paper for a lifetime, and it's cheaper to buy it that way, but of course you need lots of people to be able to do it. And workers would own the factories. And the idea here, and this is something that's become common now in many places, if the workers own the factories, the workers will work harder. I mean, think about it. If I were a part owner of a McDonald's and you came to the McDonald's, I'd be really thrilled that you were there, and I would be happy to sell you that hamburger and get you to supersize it. Because I would be making more money. As it is today, workers get what they get paid regardless of how much business or whatever they get. So the idea was to make workers involved, and workers wouldn't take advantage of their fellow workers. Now, of course, they also wanted to get rid of that child labor that we've talked about, or prison labor as well too, as many people used. And we do still have prison labor, so you can't be forced to work in a prison, but they do have to pay you something. They can't make you work for free. Now, they also wanted, as you can see, greenbacks, the money that had been issued during the Civil War, to be issued more. The idea here was, and this will be a big issue during the time, is the more paper money out there, the easier it was for you to get some. The more paper money, there was more inflation. If you were a debtor, if you owed money, you were paying back in money that was worth a little less than what it had been. It was easier for you to pay back that money. They also wanted something that's very much in the news these days, and something sadly we still haven't reached, which is equal jobs and equal pay. Women make about, on average, 77 to 80 cents or so what men do for equal jobs, and that's, of course, is still.
We can dance, everybody's taking the time.
Now, what this is here, of course, they also wanted safety controls. They wanted more safety.
Yes, save the dance.
Now, and of course they wanted foreign labor, and of course I have here the H-2B visa. This is one thing that we have today where workers that have a needed skill that we have a shortage in can be hired by companies. A lot of your software companies do this, and they're controversial to some because they feel that these by paying these people less, they discourage Americans from learning those skills. Other people say we need these workers because if we didn't, these jobs would not get done, that Americans many Americans, or not enough Americans, have those skills. So they wanted safety codes and an end to foreign labor.
Out of the temple. I hate banks, it's just that simple.
And they hated banks. Just like Mojo Nixon.
Mason jar is okay too. If you see a bank, well, you know what to do.
So they hated banks and they wanted the national bank gone. Now, what causes their downfall? Well, we have this big outbreak of strikes in 1886 across the country. And Americans start getting very upset with all these strikers. But particularly one event is going to be what's called the Haymarket bombing, or the Haymarket riot, or even the Haymarket affair that happens in 1886. So we're going to discuss this. This is an important event in American history. We're going to go through it. So sadly, we have to say that the Knights of Labor ultimately failed. They do get some of their goals, but many of their goals turn out to be way too idealistic. And another union that's going to be formed the same year that the Knights reach their peak is going to be the one that will learn lessons from them. Now, let's talk about what happened at Haymarket. Now, there was a confrontation with Pinkertons, and we'll talk about them more later. These were hired guards that the companies could hire. They'd been intelligence officers during the Civil War, and they were kind of like rent-a-cops that you could get. And there had been a strike at the McCormick Harvester plant, and this is near Chicago. And what ends up happening is two of the strikers get killed by the Pinkertons. Anarchists, people who are opposed to all government, these people urged the workers to get together and to discuss what had happened in Haymarket Square, which was a place where, like it suggests, at one time they brought in hay and they brought in farm goods and everything like that. So they're to get there and to discuss what their next step will be. And as you can see here in this broadside, that's what we call these kind of little posters. Mass meeting tonight, 7:30, attention workingmen. Good speakers will be present to denounce the latest atrocious act of the police, the shooting of our fellow workers yesterday afternoon. So this is just the very next day that they do this. And interestingly enough here, you also see it in German, Achtung Arbeiter, attention workers. And this is because so many of the anarchists were Germans. And of course, this was the period 30 or 40 years after the mass German immigration that this country had following the failed revolutions of 1848. So what's going to result is, as I said, is called a Haymarket riot, or the Haymarket affair in 1886. Now, when they hear about that this meeting's going to happen, everybody's worried about the tensions and the anger, and they tell them, the police tell them, don't get together, don't meet. But the workers go ahead and do so, and several anarchists speak, and most of them were German, and as they speak, the police come in. Now, the meeting was actually finishing up and was breaking up. The police move in, and the rain's starting to fall, and somebody throws a bomb, as you can see here in this picture. And when that happens, several policemen get killed, as you can see here, the so-called Haymarket martyrs. We're not sure how many policemen actually died in the explosion. There's even some suggestion that some of the policemen died in the chaos that followed, but several policemen were killed. And when this happened, the police go absolutely insane.
Bad boys, what you gonna do? What you gonna do when they come for you? Bad boys, what you gonna do?
To this day, we don't even know how many people died. Many families just simply got their loved ones and buried them without notifying anybody, afraid that their loved ones would be considered part of the rioters. So cops go wild, and this is going to be an interesting thing that you'll be able to compare using synthesis to another action that happens 80 years later in Chicago. Now, the Haymarket affair has a lot of results, and bad ones for the unions in general, and especially the Knights of Labor in particular. Now, what we end up getting is a panic, and this panic can be compared to what happens after a bombing on Wall Street in the 1920s, when people imagine that there are these anarchists everywhere, and people, much like we did in America after 9/11, people lose the ability to to tell the distinction between anarchist and unionist and socialist and communist, and everybody is kind of lopped together, including anybody associated with unions. No one ever figures out who actually threw the bomb, and I guess people needed a scapegoat, so they arrest the anarchist leaders and the speakers, the people who put together the presentations and the people who were there. And what they charge them with is conspiracy, or they for organizing this meeting, and they charge them with murder because they said had they not had this meeting, had they listened to instructions, the policemen and the innocents there would not have been killed. Now, this is going to be similar to what happens in 1968. In 1968, we have the Democratic National Convention. It's also in Chicago. And the protesters there were told not to get together, but they do get together to protest the Democratic Convention and the fact that it was most likely going to continue to support the Vietnam War. Now, the protest turns violent for a variety of reasons, and the police go in, and it's later been determined to be a police riot. A bunch of heads are beaten, and once again, a scapegoat was needed, and these 7 and initially 8 men are charged with conspiracy, and they go to court, and they are found guilty. But the decision is overturned. But it is a similar thing, showing what happens in when people kind of panic in these situations. Now, of the Haymarket people, 8 of them are sentenced to be hanged. But if you look here in this picture, if my counting's right, I see only 7. So why is that? Well, one of them manages to escape the noose by attempting suicide, and he's ultimately successful. A blasting cap that you use to set off dynamite is smuggled in. He bites down on it, and it blows off his lower face, his jaw. And I mean, he's an absolute mess. And so they work all night trying to save his life, of course, so they can hang him. But the man beats them, and he ends up dying. So he is not hanged. Now, both the policeman and the anarchist have become martyrs depending on who you look at or your political beliefs. Now, where the bombing happened, this marker was put up, or this statue, and you can notice here it shows a policeman, and notice the little base of the statue here. Well, anarchists blew up this statue, and so the police decided to remove the statue, and they actually, for a while, they had a guard on it full time, but that got expensive, so the decision was made to go ahead and put the statue of the policeman in front of the police headquarters, where hopefully people will leave it alone. And if you go to where the original was, you will find a couple pieces. You'll find this piece of art, okay, of the Haymarket. You see it looks like a speaker on top of a wagon, where many of the speakers would speak from those. And you see a group of people here, or 2 men, standing in front of what's left of the marker without the policeman on it. And of course, one thing you'll see right here is the A for anarchist. So this has become a sort of a pilgrimage site for many of them. And then here you see the marker there. This is the statue or the modern art that you see above by Mary Brogger in 2004. And once again, here's that anarchist symbol. So now, even though the Knights of Labor weren't involved and had nothing to do with this, Americans' abilities to differentiate between different groups meant that the Knights of Labor were blamed, and soon they fade away. They just fade away. Now, this political cartoon is interesting, and political cartoons, then, as you guys have seen, are much, much more detailed than ours do today, and you can't really see it very well, so I'm going to do my usual thing of blowing them up in pieces so you can look at it. Now, the governor, and notice his last name, Altgeld, old gold in German, the governor had some sympathy for these folks, and he actually pardoned 3 of the leaders, but the people really resented him doing that, and he was seen as sort of a wuss, and they vilified him and they threw him out of office. But this political cartoon here is pretty strong. So let's go through and look at this and see what we can learn from this here. You see the governor, he's cutting, letting the dogs loose here. One of the dogs is already on his way. So let's look at this and see what we can get from it. Now here we see Columbia. Columbia is the name that we usually give a woman who represents America. So we see here on her cape the word Columbia, and of course she's got 2 children here that she's trying to protect. But what's happening? Well, if we look more carefully, we can see the governor here, and here is prison. And with his pardon of those 3 men, okay, he is letting the dogs loose. And if we look closely, okay, we can see to the background that statue that ends up getting blown up and then gets guarded, and then finally today is by the Chicago police station, and it reads, "To the memory of the policeman murdered by anarchists in Chicago." Okay, and then let's look at the dogs more carefully. The 3 dogs that are let loose, one is socialism itself, one is anarchy and murder, and of course they're all being lopped together. So those 3 are all being let go. And then let's finally look at the caption here. The friend of mad dogs, Governor Altgeld of Illinois, is freeing the anarchists, bitterly denounced Judge Gary and the jury that convicted him. Okay. Now, one of the next groups we're going to talk about is the American Federation of Labor. And as you can see, it's founded in 1886, and the leader and founder, and he stayed the leader until his death in San Antonio for all but 1 year, was Samuel Gompers, shown down here with the really great mustache. Now you can see their label here, AF of L, and they're shooting for 8 hours. That seems to be the goal of everybody at the time. And they said labor conquers all. Okay. And Gompers was a young Jewish immigrant, part of this new immigration. And unlike many of these new immigrants, he was able to read. And as a young boy working in the cigar factory, other workers would work while he read the newspaper or read them stories. And they didn't mind doing his work because they wanted to have something to hear. Now he begins to form this organization. He really uses the lessons from the Knights of Labor that had gone before. Now, one of the things he's worried about is the radicalism that's going to come along, the communists, the things like the Knights of Labor have been blamed for, although really had not had anything to do with it. And we see this demonstrated, for example, that Americans, we have Labor Day in September, but we don't really celebrate May Day, which most labor groups around the world do, because we see it as being associated with labor parties, and he tries to stay out of having a political party like the National Labor Union had tried to do. And what they focus on is what are called bread and butter issues. There you see bread, there you see butter. The basic things in life. When they asked him what he wanted, he said he wanted more. More what? More wages, more safe working conditions. The only thing he wanted less of were hours, the 8 hours that you see there. And he really looked at the Knights of Labor as having been too utopian with their communes and their worker-owned factories. He wanted to make the American Federation of Labor a business where the workers were employees and they would work there, and they would bargain and try to get the best deal they could, but they weren't in it to hurt the business or to hurt the company or whatever. Now, who was in the AFL? Well, at first, no women, no minorities, or unskilled workers at first. So, no ladies, no African Americans, no Chinese. I don't know how the Chinese got jobs in those days. And no unskilled laborers, okay? So who did he focus on instead? He went for the white worker, the male worker who had a skill that might take years to learn, because these workers would be much harder to replace. So here we see the white worker, their approval, and of course here you see some young girls at a protest telling people not to be a scab, not to be one of those people that cross the picket lines where the workers are protesting, that there's nothing lower. Now their method were to use boycotts to get companies, to get people to not buy products of companies unless they did better by their workers. And this is an effective method that is still used today politically for various things, as well as by unions. And strikes were possible, but oftentimes what was called collective bargaining, where the union would represent all the workers. And if you join the union, you basically gave up your right to make your decision about the wages or whatever. They would make the deal for you and hopefully get a good deal about your wages and work conditions and everything like that. They did not really go after politicians like with political parties. They weren't a union in the political union as you might see over in Great Britain. But they would, of course, reward or punish politicians who were supportive of them, throwing their support behind Democrats usually, but sometimes Republicans. Now, so here you see, of course, people demanding, or people on strike down here in the lower picture. This is from the 1930s, demanding full recognition. And here we see the collective bargaining process. You see, them the union representative discussing the plan with management, and then proposing, making their offer, and then finally bargaining, trying to get the best deal, workers giving up something, management giving up something, and then finally they reach an agreement that workers then vote on, and if the union votes on it, you have to accept it. Now, another term that you should associate with the AFL is what's known as business unionism. As I said, they wanted to see the union to be more of a business, not some sort of revolution or revolutionary group. Your union, you would pay union dues, which went to pay for representatives and lawyers. You had a company, basically the union, that had permanent employees. And of course, no revolution, because if there's a revolution, you're going to lose all of this. Now, they can be considered a success.
That's all there is to it, Dustin. That's all there is to it. A winner. Just like that.
Now, the last union we're going to discuss is the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, and their members are called Wobblies. Why they're called Wobblies is up for discussion, but many people think it's because many of their members were immigrants. They took in everybody, and a lot of the members were Finns, and the Finns apparently had a hard time saying IWW, and it came out sounding like Wobblies. But that's just an explanation in theory. And we're going to look at particularly a man by the name of Eugene Debs. Now, here we see their symbol, and they still use this symbol today, Industrial Workers of the World. Now, Debs is one of the many founders, but he's the one most associated with them, at least in the early days. Now, Eugene Debs had been a leader of the American Railroad Union, a union that calls a wildcat, that is an unauthorized strike, in Pullman, Illinois. And after being arrested and thrown in jail, he is radicalized. He becomes a socialist in jail by reading Karl Marx. And he doesn't become a full-out communist, but he does become a socialist and becomes a leader of the Socialist Party in the United States. Another important leader is this guy, Big Bill Haywood. He'll be their leader in the 20s and 30s after Debs' death, and he'll eventually get disenchanted with the United States, and he'll move to Russia. Now, Debs runs for president 5 different times, and he loses all 5 times here. But you see the slogan from Karl Marx, "Workers of the World Unite," from the Communist Manifesto, and we see him his running here. Now, the most famous race that he runs in is in 1912, that he gets 1 million votes in, and this is that race that Teddy Roosevelt comes back in and splits the Republican Party, and Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat, manages to win the presidency. But Debs, showed there was a lot of support for socialists by getting a full 1 million votes. Now, the last time he runs in jail, and this has got to be one of my favorite campaign buttons, I have one of these, is he ran from jail as convict 9653, and he got quite a few votes in, not quite the 1 million he'd gotten before, but he was very well liked, even by his opponents. Now, so who was in the IWW? Well, first of all, they took in everybody, and they wanted to take in all unions from all over the world and not just the United States. They wanted one giant union, as you can see here in one of their posters, one big union of all the workers, the IWW. In numbers there is strength, and all people would be invited, as you see in this more recent poster. All workers, all genders, prisoners, ex-workers, unemployed, all races. And then finally, it is our collective best interest to overthrow capitalism. So that is their goal, to actually replace capitalism. So their main goal, overthrow capitalism, replace it with socialism, as well as the more typical bread and butter issues. We see the things like more wages that the other unions wanted, like the AFL, better working conditions, shorter hours. But ultimately, they wanted to abolish the wage system, abolish unemployment, have democracy in the shop where the workers would pick their own manager. So in some ways, they have some utopian ideas, kind of like the Knights of Labor. They wanted to get paid well for what they did, or they wouldn't work hard. As we can see, they'll give you bum work. So think it over. Join the one big union. Fight for the full product of your labor. You should get what you pay, and this is a very communistic idea that, you know, what you add to the product by your effort, you should get, and not have to share that with managers. So we see some similarities and some differences there. Now, they believe strikes were perfectly okay. Even violence was condoned in some cases. And they practiced what was called sabotage. It's a French word, and sabot in French is a shoe or a sandal. And this comes from workers that used to not want to work or wanted to protest, would take off their sandal or their shoe, and they would put it into the machinery and bust the machinery, sabotage in it, and that's where the term comes from. So they believed in that. And when you look at their posters, their later posters, you will see this object down here in their posters, and that is a black cat. And the black cat symbolized and reminded workers of sabotage if necessary. There you go. So look for the cat. Now, and this is a very cool looking poster, at least in my opinion. I love this kind of art. But you see, you know, the sun has been replaced by the IWW shining down on the workers and bringing a bright new day for all of them. And so here we see their support of strikes, IWW, and we see what are they striking against? Lack of dignity, low wages, long hours, speed ups where they would speed up the assembly line, unsafe conditions, and those are the things they're trying to knock out. Okay. Now this is their song, the International here. This is the German version, the Russian version. Big role. Now, how did the IWW view capitalism? Okay, well, this is a very famous poster, and I'm going to break it down for you to see, but here is the poster or the image here, and you see pyramid of the capitalist system. So how did they believe our system worked? And this will explain why they wanted to get rid of it so much. Well, first of all, at the very top, we have the very rich. We have kings. You can see them here in their fancy clothes, and of course money is on top of everything. Capitalism, and these people will rule you. And then below them and supporting them is the church, right? You see various Orthodox church here, and maybe a Lutheran pastor or Anglican pastor here. And of course this says, we fool you. Communists believed that religion was the opiate of the masses, that it was given to people to keep them kind of quiet, to keep them believing in an afterlife so they wouldn't really try to improve this life and make them accept things that they really shouldn't accept. And then underneath that we have the soldiers that don't protect us in their view, but shoot at you and kill these workers. And indeed they would kill some of the IWW workers, but we see them. And then we see the people who the rich, and who are just sitting around enjoying these multiple course meals, kind of like when you think of like on Titanic, these multiple course that takes you hours to eat. And these people all rest on top of finally the workers. And we see the workers, and down here it says, we work for all, we feed all. And you see some of them are getting angry about it. Some of them are raising their fist. Here a guy's waving the red flag of revolution. But you see the other workers, men and women and children here, and one is even on the ground supporting this system. So this is how they viewed things, and this is why they thought the system had to go. Now, the IWW is still with us today, but it had some really, really lean times, and a lot of that has to do with what happens during World War I. Now, World War I was quite popular with Americans, and the Wobblies, on the other hand, were very opposed to this. And during the war, anything that maybe smacked of opposition to the war was seen as pro-German. And they openly fought the draft. Eugene Debs, one reason he went to jail was his opposition to the draft. And many Americans were angered by this, and as I said, saw them as German sympathizers. So here we see, somebody looking here. I don't know if this is a Wobbly, if that's his outfit, because some of them did dress like that. But it's in his hands, of course, is a bomb with IWW plots, because they believed that it was okay to sabotage even the factories that were making our weapons of war, because they were opposed to war and opposed to the whole idea of workers fighting and helping others to kill fellow workers. And of course, the communist revolution is going to play a big role too. And what we see here, and many Americans got nervous that if it could happen there, and there was a brief communist uprising in Germany and in Hungary, it looked like it might be spreading around the world. And then we had an incident where a man brought a baby carriage filled with explosives into the financial center of New York, and it went off. And this was the worst terrorist attack on U.S. soil until we had the Oklahoma City bombing. And 20 or more, I think, Americans were killed in this, and the scars are still there today. Back here you see Federal Hall, and this is where George Washington, although in a different building, took the oath of office and was sworn in as our first president. But you can see like a Model T has been overturned here, and the damage was quite severe. From what I heard, the assassin, they figured out who he was, or the bomber, they found out who he was by his scalp, which was found a good distance away. And apparently a barber who treated him said that he knew who he was, recognized him by his hair. But they, much like the Knights of Labor, were blamed for this incident. Now, they were much more radical than the Knights of Labor, and they did condone violence, unlike the Knights of Labor, but they had not been involved in this. This was an anarchist. But once again, Americans aren't very good at differentiating people. And so the IWW were blamed with everybody and considered anarchist, and indeed some of them were actually deported. So there's a lot of pressure on the group, and a lot of people leave them. And here we see a picture of some of the bodies lined up from the bombing. Now, the IWW is still with us today. They put out a digital magazine that you can see here, and they're still around, but not nearly as large as they were, or as the AFL. So they're not quite a success, but not exactly a failure. Now, one of their most famous songwriters and martyrs was a man by the name of Joe Hill. Now, Joe Hill, shown right here, was an IWW member, and he'd written a lot of the songs that are in their songbook. Now, there's a robbery in Salt Lake City, and this is right at the beginning of World War I, before America's involved. And this man and his son get murdered, and allegedly the robbers, and this is going to be kind of similar to what happens with Sacco and Vanzetti, in the sense that there seems to be a case of him being railroaded. The robbers wore red bandanas. You know, maybe they're communists, maybe they're IWW, and one of them gets wounded. Well, Hill shows up at that same hospital, and he's wounded. And they think, there you go, we got IWW guy, and he's wounded. Now, he claimed that he'd been shot in an argument, but he wouldn't name the woman that supposedly had shot him. And so we have a quick trial, and in the heat of the moment, much like Sacco and Vanzetti, he is found guilty. And not just found guilty, but in Utah, they actually have a firing squad, so they shot him. Now, his ashes, or he was cremated, and his ashes were scattered all around, and they even took some of them to Sweden. A lot of Scandinavians, as I said, Finns, as well as Swedes, were members of the IWW, and they scattered his ashes, but Utah didn't get any since they were the ones who had executed him. His songs live today, and they're still a very popular song about him.
Last night, alive as you and me, says I, but Joe, you're 10 years dead. I never died, says he. I never died, says he. In Salt Lake, Joe, by God, says I, him standing by my bed. They framed you on a murder charge, says Joe, but I ain't dead. Says Joe, but I ain't dead. The copper bosses shot you, Joe. They killed you, Joe, says I. Takes more than guns to kill a man, says Joe, I didn't die. Says Joe, I didn't die. Standing there as big as life, smiling with his eyes, Joe says what they forgot to kill went on to organize. Went on to organize. Joe Hill ain't dead, he says to me. Joe Hill ain't never died. Where working men go out on strike, Joe Hill is at their side. Joe Hill is at their side. From San Diego up to Maine, I saw Joe Hill last night, alive as you and me. Says I, but Joe, you're 10 years dead. I never died, says he. I never died, says he.
Okay. Now, another case to show you the passions of the time will involve Wesley Everest. Now, there was a parade in Centralia, Washington, in Washington State, and Legionnaires marched, and they marched right in front of the Wobbly Hall as part of the march. Now, somebody fired a shot. We don't know who, as often is the case, and what ends up happening is the American Legionnaires start shooting, and they kill a bunch of these Wobblies. But what happens with with the ones who are arrested is even more shocking. Wesley Everest, who was one of the most outspoken of the Wobblies, they break into jail, they haul him out, and it's just unbelievable what ends up happening to this man. They beat him up, knocking out his teeth with the rifle butt. They castrate him. They put a noose around his head. They tie it to a bridge, and they throw him from the bridge 3 times to break his neck. And then they finally shoot him to finish him off. Now, when the coroner is brought in to investigate what happened to Wesley Everest, basically he says the death was, wait for it, a suicide. And this just kind of shows you the kind of the anger, the kind of antipathy that a lot of people had towards these folks. This, how frightening the times were that this kind of thing would be condoned. All right, and of course he is yet another. Now you can look at this graph here, and you can see how all of these things together, these different unions, eventually attracted thousands, 1,000 being 1 million, of course, members, and the number just seemed to grow throughout all of these times throughout the war. It kind of flattens a little bit, but it continues to grow and will continue to grow through the Great Depression as well. So they were very successful despite all the obstacles in unionizing workers in one way. Well, thank you for your attention. This is just to let you know this has been another fine production from...
Sometimes you feel like a nut, sometimes you don't.